All right, so this week we're going to be talking about World War II and the home front. And before the United States entered the war, Franklin Delano Roosevelt had a speech talking about the future world order and the four freedoms that every individual should have: the freedom of speech, the freedom of worship, the freedom from want, meaning every nation should have a healthy peacetime life for its inhabitants, and lastly, the freedom from fear, which meant a worldwide reduction of armaments. Um, and as we will see, once the United States gets out of the war, unemployment will disappear, the gross national product doubles, people move from the north and west, and after the war, we'll see that American freedom kind of becomes global in scope. Besides in the Soviet Union and later in China, but for the most part, Western Europe, much of South America will come under this kind of global four freedoms that FDR is talking about. This becomes crucial language, and free enterprise is going to rule the day. So real quickly, we're going to go through kind of what happens before, or what kind of starts World War II. Before, FDR comes up with this good neighbor policy because international relations before 1933 really meant nothing to the United States because they were so worried about getting out of the Depression. And in 33, FDR even recognizes the USSR as a real entity so they can trade with them. His good neighbor policy repudiated the U.S. getting involved in the Western Hemisphere. He takes a big step back from kind of what Teddy Roosevelt wanted to do. But he's still helping dictators: Anastasio Somoza in Nicaragua, Rafael Trujillo Molina in Dominican Republic, and Batista in Cuba, because they all have U.S. interests in mind. About Somoza, some of you may have heard of this. He may be an SOB, but he's our SOB, meaning we still own him, even though we know he's a bad person. The road to war. By the mid-30s, it was clear that the rule of law in Europe was going downhill. In 1931, Japan had invaded Manchuria and created its own state there called the Manchukuo State. And 6 years later, it runs over China through the rape of Nanking, and they behave quite poorly in China, and they take over that country as well. In 1936, in Europe, Hitler had sent troops into the Rhineland, which was taken from them after World War I. It's kind of part of it's in Germany, part of it's in France. It's along the Rhine River. The Rhine River kind of cuts the two countries in half today. Hitler sends troops in there, which was supposed to be a demilitarized zone after World War I. France, Britain, and U.S. did not do anything, and this kind of showed Hitler that democracies were failing at the time. At the same time, Mussolini, another fascist, invaded Ethiopia, and he was trying to take over that in Africa, so he was also trying to expand. And in 1938, Hitler annexed Austria and Sudetenland because he said, he basically talked about how he was going to make sure that every native German speaker would be safe from foreign infringement, and there's a whole bunch of German speakers in the Sudetenland and in Austria. In fact, they call it Anschluss, is what they call it, and still, Western governments aren't doing anything. Appeasing's not working because he just keeps expanding. But still, this is 1938. In America, this seems distant to most people. And some of them even look at the oncoming fight between Hitler and Stalin, which was inevitable, as a good thing, right? Let them kill themselves. And at the same time, we're also still doing business with Germany, Stalin, and Japan. But this changes when Congress passes the Neutrality Acts. And what the Neutrality Acts were is they banned travel on belligerent ships and the sale of arms to countries at war. Okay, so the the United States stopped becoming gun runners after that. Um, and Congress kind of hoped that these policies would keep the United States out of World War II because they were still they still were remembered World War One. Okay. Meanwhile, in Europe, the Munich Agreement was signed in 1938. What that was is Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia because there are a lot of German speakers there. Well, and he was looking to dominate the world, but his excuse was because there were a lot of German speakers there. Um, so Britain and France sit down in Munich and they cave into Hitler and they say, okay, that's fine, you can have Czechoslovakia, but don't go any further, okay? Because they still see Germany as this bulwark against communism, right? Um, a year later, Stalin asked Britain and France to sign a pact to halt Hitler because it was inevitable that Hitler was going to invade Poland and then come into the Soviet Union. Britain and France say no because they didn't trust Stalin. So what Stalin does is he goes ahead and signs a non-aggression pact with Hitler, and so Hitler invades Poland. And when Hitler invaded Poland, Hitler and Stalin agreed to cut Poland in half. So when Hitler invaded Poland, the France and Britain had to declare war because Poland was their ally. And at the same time, he also moves into Scandinavia, Belgium, which is a neutral country, and the Netherlands. And then from there, it was quick and easy. By June of 1940, in a little under a year, he occupies Paris. He's dominating Europe and North Africa. And in September of 1940, Germany, Japan, and Italy get together and they sign the Tripartite Act, which was the three fascist states signing an act saying if anybody goes to war against us, you're going to war against one of us, you're going to war against all of us. So as all of these things are happening, the United States is moving toward intervention. FDR likens Hitler to a thug, and he comes up with him and Congress come up with the cash and carry scheme, which is to sell arms to Britain, but Britain would pay in cash, and they would be transported in the United States ships. And that's about all they could manage, because in 1940 FDR is looking at an election, and he doesn't still Americans were not that keen on going to war at this time. Okay. But once he does win the next election, he declares in 1941 that the U.S. will be a great arsenal of democracy. Okay, so then Congress passes the Lend-Lease Act, which promises military aid if countries promise to pay it off after the war. So this act sent billions and billions of dollars of arms, mainly to Britain and China. And then they even send quite a few arms to the USSR when Hitler invades the Soviet Union in June 1941. At the same time, FDR freezes all of the Japanese assets that he can and stops giving them oil, which is a very big deal because Japan cannot produce its own oil, and so it needs to import it. And one of the major importers to Japan before 1941 was the United States. So he stops doing that. And a lot of people think this is kind of what ended up Japan actually bombing Pearl Harbor. Not only were they mad, but they needed oil. Okay. And so at the end of November of 1941, I'm sorry, at the end of November, they did intercept a signal that a Pacific assault was imminent, but they didn't know where. So the United States, by the end of November, could see, especially their intelligence, could see that Japan was heading towards them. They just had no idea where they were going to attack. Some people said California, some people said Alaska, some people said Hawaii, some people said other islands that the United States occupied at this time. So nobody really knew where. And then if you'd like to do your your PowerPoint on Pearl Harbor, I'm sure I'll get quite a few. December 7th, 1941, as FDR says, the day of infamy. And it was the first attack on American soil by foreigners since Britain attacked in the War of 1812. So this is one of the reasons why there's so many isolationists in America, because there had not been a war for on American soil for over 120 years, basically 130 years. Okay, so America was very good at staying out of foreign wars that didn't deal with South America. The attack on Pearl Harbor left 2,000 killed, 187 aircrafts, and 18 ships destroyed or damaged. The next day, Congress votes 477 to 1 to declare war on Japan, and the next day, Nazi Germany declares war on the United States. So at first, even though FDR took a Europe first mentality, the first real part of the war was fought in the Pacific. It was called the Gross National Product War, meaning who could produce the most would win. The beginning was the disaster for the U.S. By early 1942, Japan had conquered Burma and Thailand, Indonesia, and all of these places have oil. Guam, the Philippines, etc. And then here's another interesting thing you could talk about if you wanted to do your PowerPoint on. There was this thing called the Bataan Death March, BATAAN, where 78,000 Americans and Filipinos were beat on the island, which is the largest surrender in U.S. military history. And so what they did is they marched these prisoners miles and miles through wet, humid terrain, and 1,000 died in the ensuing march to the POW camp. At the same time, in the Atlantic, German subs were sinking all kinds of ships. We already knew that Germans are very good at submarine warfare. In Europe, at the beginning of the war, after the occupation of France, it took until 1943 for the United States and Britain to really make a dent, especially with the submarine warfare. What ends up happening is for the next 3 years, they really plan a large-scale invasion, and it comes on June 6, 1944, which is also known as D-Day. You've all seen Saving Private Ryan. That's D-Day. And the landing on Normandy, headed by Dwight Eisenhower, with 1 million troops, still the largest amphibious force in history. And by August, they were in Paris. But really, the most important strategic, by 1943, by D-Day, by 1944, most people knew that the war was over. Even most of the German army had a feeling, because the most strategic fighting was really in the east, and that was against the Soviet Union. If you would like to look this up, or also write a report on that, you can write a report on the D-Day. You can write a report on the fighting in the East, like the Battle of Stalingrad, things like that. And a lot of people argue that really the Soviet Union had already won the war. It was just kind of the United States and Britain coming in and making sure that they got a piece of the Western Hemisphere. The operations that the Germans did to move to the east was called Operation Barbarossa, and it involved more than 3 million Germans and other nationalities to invade the Soviet Union. In August 1942, they tried to take Stalingrad, and in the fighting, more than 2 million people died. I think the movie called Enemy at the Gates with Jude Law and I can't remember the other guy's name, where they're snipers and they're fighting each other during the war. The beginning of that movie is the Battle of Stalingrad, so it's kind of an interesting idea where people would die. The Soviets were sending out people behind guys with guns because they didn't have enough guns or bullets. So when the guy in front of you died, you would pick up his gun and you would start shooting and running, and then somebody was following you, etc., etc. 2 million people died during this battle. In the end, of the war. Of the 13.6 million German casualties, 10 million were in Russia. Okay, so Russia was the Soviet Union was a very important uh, strategic arena for World War II. Millions of Polish people died. Obviously, millions of Jewish people died, but most of the people who were Jewish who died were actually Polish. They lived in Poland. 2 million Russians died, but there's probably more because you don't really know how many Russians actually killed other Russians because with Joseph Stalin and things like that, and because nobody has a real accurate count of things like that. So it was probably much more than 20 million. But that was a real quick rundown of World War II. You could talk about World War II for a year. But in the end, as we all know, Nazi Germany, Italy, and Japan end up surrendering. And we're going to talk a little bit about the end of the war on our last slide in the atomic bomb debate. All right, so meanwhile, we're going to talk about how the home front mobilized. Really, World War II and the New Deal transforms the role of the national government. They create a war production board, a manpower commission, all of these typical governmental names of different bureaucracies. And what these things did is they regulated the allocation of labor, they controlled the shipping industry, they established manufacturing quotas. They fixed wages, prices, and rents. Federal workers went from 1 to 4 million, and unemployment went from 14 to 2%. They built houses and automobiles to make jeeps, tanks, anything that the military was going to need. The GNP, the gross national product, went from 91 to $214 billion. They began making war bombs, increasing taxes, and withholding income tax directly from paychecks, all to pay for this. Business blossomed. There were thousands of aircraft that needed to be made, hundreds of thousands of armored vehicles, 2.5 million trucks, rubber, radar, jets, engines, computers, all of these things. And where a lot of these jobs went to was Seattle, Portland, and San Francisco. Billions of dollars were poured into these port towns, Long Beach, Los Angeles. 2 million people moved to California. The South even begins to industrialize for the first time, but they're still quite poor. And really, this war is still known as the Good War, right? The United States and Britain, by the time World War II started, were really the only two last functioning democracies on the planet. And Britain was getting bombed by Germany basically every day. Britain was faltering. So this is really known as the Good War, and this war didn't really divide U.S. society. So they try to sell the war as freedom, especially in 1941 because that was the 150 years of the Bill of Rights. And so the whole idea of freedom, this ambiguous freedom, was freedom from want, but somehow this was the most important to everyday Americans. This is kind of how they discussed freedom in the World War II arena, is that you should not have to want for anything. And this is when this whole idea of protecting for the future, the standard of living of the American worker and the farmer was key rhetoric. And in a lot of places you also had the fifth freedom, and what advertisers and big companies bombarded the U.S. consumer with the freedom of free enterprise or choice. The freedom of choice. Since you live in America, you have a choice. So this was also the fifth freedom. And everybody could tell that with this big war machine rolling, that the Depression was getting left behind and prosperity was in the future. At the same time, women were glorified by Hollywood. This is Rosie the Riveter. If you guys haven't seen this, I'm sure you have. This is a muscular, self-reliant woman who was famously painted by Norman Rockwell. A few facts about women. By 1944, more than one-third of the labor force was women, and there were 350,000 women in auxiliary military units. That is a staggering amount uh, women in the military. A third of them were in aircraft manufacturing and shipbuilding in California. Um, and the interesting thing about this is married women in their 30s outnumbered young and single workers. And so this really forced unions to confront things like childcare, equal work pay, maternity leaves, things that are still kind of debated today, right? Women don't get paid as much as men for the new job. How much time off should they get for maternity leave, paid leave, things of that nature? This is when this starts to come to the forefront in these discussions. And some even engaged outwardly in sex before marriage, if you can believe it. That sounds kind of corny, but at the time it wasn't. It wasn't. It was a somewhat of a big deal if you were having outwardly, if you were showing outward emotion that you definitely were having sex before marriage. The unfortunate part is most lost their jobs after the war, and advertising kind of went back to this vision of the future and kind of Susie Homemaker, right? You don't, after the war, Rosie the Riveter kind of goes by the wayside, and you get back to commercials about washing machines making your life easier and dishwashers and Leave It to Beaver and things like that. But we'll discuss that later. But during the war, women were just as important as men, and they did a lot in the workforce. There was also, even before the war was over, these visions of freedom, especially of post-war freedom. Many heard and read Henry Luce's American Century, which basically stated that it was going to be America's century, and history had thrust it into being the dominant world power. Very prophetic, actually. The whole point of this is the 20th century was supposed to be the German century, right? Science, literature, art, power, all efficiency, all of these things were in Germany, and Germany was supposed to come out of World War I after it came out of the doldrums. It was supposed to be the powerhouse, but what ends up happening is it really does become the American century. And then this book talks about abundant life and free economic enterprise. And what the U.S. should do is embrace it like no nation ever has before, and the United States should exert its influence all over the world. So really there's this new conception of America's role in the world tied to international involvement, promise of economic abundance, and that the American experience should serve as models for others, right? This whole idea of spreading democracy and the four freedoms really comes to the forefront in the 1940s, because you got to remember, most Americans after World War I were isolationists, no question about it. At the same time, Henry Wallace writes that it's not what Luce says, but rather it's going to be the century of the common man. Where Luce was calling for a free global enterprise, Wallace calls for a global New Deal. The New Deal that FDR just said. He said all of the revolutions, the American, the French, there's a huge revolution in 1848 in Europe, the Russian Revolution, all of these revolutions were for the common man, and they were bloody and they were violent, all of them, but they still worked nonetheless. It was the common person who started these revolutions. He says we hear about the four freedoms and we don't really think anything about it because of the society we live in, but to the world these are great things that should be fought for. He talks about nobody should exploit anyone else. You need to learn how to supply for your whole family. So he said, and that's what being a common man is getting up, going to work, and doing your job and supporting your family, right? And but what he also adds is that government planning is the key to economic independence on the world stage. So basically you had these two ideas after World War II. What role does the federal government have? The federal government had a role in everyday life during the war, and the economy skyrocketed. But the reason why the economy skyrocketed is because we were selling guns and arms and making billions of dollars off of the war. So you have this idea that government planning worked, but then you also have the idea that America was built on free enterprise, and what we really need is this global community of free enterprise. So these were kind of the two discussions that people were having by the time the war was coming to an end. Okay, so World War II brings to the forefront what a lot of historians and sociologists and other people who study this call the American dilemma. And this basically is this. The Nazis had a theory of their master race, and it discredited any type of ethnic and racial equality, right? It's basically blonde haired, blue eyes are at the top, and everybody else was not equal to that. Well, the U.S. is fighting World War II, and they're telling everybody that all Americans are equal and they're all loyal, but in reality, that was a contradiction. And so that's what the dilemma is. America telling people how great democracy is outside of America, and that racial inequality is not true, but the civil rights movement was still 20 years away. Okay, the South was still heavily segregated, and people of and non-whites had less advantages than white people. Um, but what ends up happening is this patriotic assimilation, because World War II creates this huge melting pot, especially for European immigrants, because millions of people start moving out of their ethnic neighborhoods, uh, and they go into the army. They're drafted into the army, or they start working at plants, and everybody's working together. The whole racism and nativism, which is the idea of inborn racial differences, biological differences, sociologically different, all of that is it is discredited as we see all of these people working together equally, and they're all doing the same job just as well as everybody else. Um, but at the same time, there was still a lot of racial inequality in this country. Um, Racial barriers still did exist. The Southern blacks were entrenched in segregations. Asians couldn't emigrate or become citizens, and most Native Americans lived on reservations in poverty in 1942. And we'll also discuss one of the most embarrassing things that the United States government has ever done, and that was the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. Um, in 1942, though, what happens is the Americans and the Mexicans come up with this thing called the Bracero Program, and it's a plan as tens of thousands of Mexicans to come help with labor in the domestic arenas, household labor, and in agriculture. And from 1942 to it lasted from 1942 to 1964, and more than 4.5 million Mexicans entered America with contracts, and this really helped the second generation population of Mexican Americans. Hundreds of thousands to millions of them go to school. They serve in the military. They helped in the defense industries. They learned English. They intermarried. Um, and they became what people would consider to be a United States American citizen today. Um, at the same time, there was still this animosity towards people, towards immigrant. And in 1943, you had the Zoot Suit riots, which some of you may have heard uh, the song before. It's basically what happened was this. In 1943, there were a whole bunch of sailors and policemen that go after Mexican Americans in Los Angeles, and it kind of turns into a riot. The Los Angeles Police Department, much like what we're dealing with today, has been known to be um, somewhat racist at times, and so this is kind of one of the beginnings of it. And so what happens is people from the Navy and policemen begin targeting mostly second generation Mexican Americans, and this kind of showed that pluralism is not there. If you want to look up what a zoot suit looks like, this is kind of what a lot of Mexican Americans were wearing at the time, and that's why it's called the Zoot Suit riots. It was eventually put down, well, stopped by the police. Um, you also have Native Americans, 25,000 served in war, and you also had what was called Navajo Code Talkers, which I believe is the name of the movie that Nicolas Cage is in. There is a movie about this. They transmitted messages because no one could translate the language. Um, these Navajos, some of the best cryptographers and translators in the world, especially the Japanese, had no way of deciphering the Navajo language because it was so much different than anything they'd ever heard before. So they were used in the U.S. I'm pretty sure the movie is called Code Talkers. Um, at the same time, the Iroquois nations, kind of in the Northeast, said the U.S. cannot draft their men, so they declared war on the Nazis themselves. Kind of interesting, right? Um, and many Native Americans do leave reservations for industries, and many of them do not return. And of the 25,000 that served in the war, some took the GI Bill to go to school, and this was all very new. This was all very new for Native Americans. This idea of being of getting a college education. So, in a sense, this helped them out. At the same time, Asian Americans. This one of the worst historical things in the history of the United States, probably after slavery. I don't know if you can compare the two or rank one above the other because they're both so despicable. But this, I should say, this goes into the same arena. Many feared that the Japanese were going to invade California, so there was a lot of pressure by people, and so FDR enacts Executive Order 9066 on February 1942, and it was the expulsion of all Japanese Americans from the West Coast, which was more than 100,000 people, and two-thirds of them were actual American citizens, and they were sent to internment camps. Um, in the end, they didn't get to Hawaii, though, because they were too dependent on Japanese Americans for labor in Hawaii. Um, so I believe that there was an internment camp in southern Idaho. So basically, what happens is they were these quasi-military camps, which were made up of like former horse stables, shacks. You guys have probably all talked about this, so we'll go through it quickly. Or barracks, usually behind barbed wire. Roll call was at 6:45 each morning. But once the Japanese got there, they tried to make it as home-like as possible. They had decorations, flowers, curtains, gardens. They had really good baseball teams. If you look up pictures of this time period, you'll see that most camps had their own baseball team, which is kind of cool. The problem with this, besides actually taking American citizens of any race or nationality and putting them into camps, the federal government did this, is that there was no court hearing, there was no due process, etc. And maybe the worst part about it is no one really says anything about it in America. I'm not just talking about Japanese Americans, I'm talking about all Americans in general. I'm talking about like the ACLU, things of that nature. Nobody really says anything. And what's even more incredible is that 20,000 still joined the army, even after a lot of Japanese Americans were being sent to camp. But people of age were still applying to join the U.S. military. And really, it wasn't until 1988, when Ronald Reagan passed the act, that the Japanese families were compensated and an official government apology came from them. That's kind of a short version of what happened. If you'd like, you can definitely do your report on this. There's tons and tons of information about this out there. And in 1944 was a very important court trial. It was Korematsu versus the United States, and the Supreme Court denies leniency for Korematsu, who got arrested for refusing to go to camp because he was a citizen who was actually born in the United States of America. Okay, and really he wasn't accused of a crime, and he was arrested without doing anything wrong and sent to jail. So this was a highly illegal act that was created, this Korematsu versus Japan. I mean, there's no constitutional reason why he should have been arrested, especially since he wasn't accused of a real crime, because you can't accuse somebody of a crime that they committed when it's not a crime, right? So, anyways, this was kind of the short version of the internment camps. If you're interested in them, you can definitely do your project on those. There's tons and tons and tons of information out there. And like I said, I know there was one in southern Idaho. I just can't remember where it was or what it was called. As far as African Americans go, the wartime message of freedom hit home for many. And there's kind of the saying of, I would rather die for democracy here than in Germany. A lot of African Americans realized the American dilemma early, right? Um, Washington, D.C. was still a segregated city. The Red Cross refused to mix white and white and black blood, and many say that's just accepting Nazi theories, right? So this is kind of the proof of this whole American dilemma, right? The United States was still very segregated. Charles Drew, who was actually the African American scientist who helped invent the storage of plasma, which helped many soldiers, said there is no scientific basis for this. If you're A positive blood, it doesn't matter if you're from Japan or Mexico or Canada or Africa or anywhere. A positive blood is A positive blood, right? So, and and actually the inventing of the storage of plasma saved many people's lives, American lives in World War II. And at the same time, you also get this great migration north, which dwarfed the earlier one, right? They're starting to move to plants. About 700,000 people move north on what are called Liberty trains, and they're seeking jobs in the heartland, especially Detroit, Cincinnati, Cleveland, kind of these working industrial class towns. Um, a lot of them encountered hostile violence, especially in Detroit, where whites really forced the police to evict newly emigrated blacks. And in 1943, a fight in a park escalates to 34 dead, and a hate strike of 20,000 protesting blacks starts in an airplane plant. So um, even in the North, that 80 years after the Civil War, even though the North was supposed to be fighting to free slaves, in some senses, not completely, but in some senses, people still didn't like African Americans moving up north, right, into places like Detroit, which is a highly African American population now. I don't think they've had a white mayor, I read recently, in 60 years or something like that. So, I mean, this move north really changed the demographics of a lot of cities. As far as the military goes, they were in the Air Force. There's quite a few movies about that out there. Um, or excuse me, they were not in the Air Force or the Marines, but the Army restricted the number that could enlist, and in the end, they only had 5 African American officers, and 3 of them were chaplains, which chaplains are preachers, pastors type of things. Um, I can't remember what the movie is about the African American fighter pilots, but that also came out somewhat recently. In the Navy, they were only allowed as cooks and waiters, but more than 1 million African Americans served in segregated units. But they were also largely confined to construction, transportation, and were supposed to stay out of military engagement. Uh, and what's worse is some had to give up their seats on trains for Nazi prisoners of war, right? And in a lot of cases, when African American veterans came back from Europe, many were not helped by the GI Bill and didn't benefit from health care or college assistance, job training, or cheap loans that most veterans get. This isn't all African Americans, but some were not helped by this. Um, they were kind of limited on what they could do if they did get it. Most of them could only use the GI Bill at segregated colleges, which kind of limited job training and limited loans. Meaning, the historically all black colleges, that's basically where most African Americans could use their GI Bill. So even when they came back after fighting the war against a war against a country that rose up on racial inequality. They came back to America and they still weren't allowed to go to school, a lot of schools that white people were allowed to, etc., get jobs, job training, loans, etc., all of these things. And really, what ends up happening is this becomes the birth of the civil rights because many were angered by the lack of jobs in industry. And they were angered about when they got back from fighting the war that they still weren't seen as equal citizens, right? Especially since the whole point of America fighting the war is to prove that everybody is equal, right? And this is where, for instance, for those who didn't go fight the war, there were about 100,000 aircraft jobs created because of the war, and only 300 of them ended up being African Americans, right? That's not per capita a right number. This is where you get labor leaders like A. Philip Randolph in 1941 calling for a march on Washington, demanding an end to segregation and a national anti-lynching law, things like that. In a lot of places, the federal government did not get involved when people were lynched in the 1940s. I mean, that's incredible. Um, and one person close, even though FDR really didn't care too much about this kind of thing, especially during World War II, because he was kind of sick, but also he was more worried about what was going on in Europe and in Asia as opposed to what was going on in the home front. But many people in his cabinet said that most people in the government were scared half to death of, especially if A. Philip Randolph saying, I'm going to march on Washington, which in, 20 years, the civil rights movement actually does. So what ends up happening is FDR creates Executive Order 8802, right? So when you're in war, you can create these orders, these executive orders. And he says he created this saying there should be no discrimination in defense jobs and established an entity to make sure that this law is complied with. And this entity is called the FEPC, the Federal Employment Practice Commission. It was basically the first government entity since Reconstruction to campaign for equal rights for blacks. Federal government, okay, not state government. And it actually worked. So by 1944, there were more than 1 million African Americans in the workforce, and 300,000 of them were women who held manufacturing jobs. One woman said, whose sister got a job working in an airplane factory, she said, my sister always said Hitler got us out of the white folks' kitchen, right? So instead of being basically a domestic servant, they had Hitler to thank for getting America in the war, and for African American women to get jobs that were outside of the house. At the same time, you also had this Double V campaign, which was somewhat important. The Double V meant not just victory in Europe and Asia, but also on the home front. This was a movement for mostly African Americans, but also all non-whites in America, and a lot of white people joined also. The NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, grows from 500,000, or excuse me, from 50,000 to 500,000. CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, begins to hold sit-ins in northern cities to integrate restaurants and movie theaters. And so this is really what you have as the beginning of the civil rights movement. And perhaps what's most importantly, to African Americans at this time, freedom from fear, which was one of the 4 freedoms the United States was fighting for, meant an end to lynching and freedom from want, but this also included doing away with being discriminated in getting a job. Okay, that's what in 1940s a lot of African Americans felt was freedom, that they could go apply for a job and get it based on their experience and their smarts, not on their skin color. And at the same time, there was a few militant African American groups starting to rise up in the South, and many Southern politicians became alarmed by this. Um, and the governor of Alabama even comes out and says, "Don't start using war as an excuse to get equal rights." Right? So um, it's kind of there's this whole interesting contradiction and dichotomy between what America's fighting for overseas and kind of what's happening in the country. But at the same time, African Americans made a giant step at this time, especially in being able to group together and create their own type of movement. Um, and really what hits the nail on the head was in 1944 a book called An American Dilemma comes out, and it's this huge account of the country's racial past, present, and what it could be in the future. And it was written by this Swedish guy named Gunnar Myrdal. And really what he does is he showed how deeply entrenched in politics, law, economics, and social behavior, how entrenched this idea of um, racial inequality really was in America. And really what he says is that if anything is going to get done, it's going to have to be done by the federal government. And as we see by the end of the war, the federal government is starting to get their hands involved in this, um, and really does a few things to help at least get the civil rights movement going. All right, so lastly, we're just going to talk about the last battle of the war real quick, and then the atomic bomb, and kind of what's going to happen post-World War II. Like we talked about earlier, by 1944, everyone knew that the war was over. But in December, Hitler launched a surprise counterattack in France to try to get Paris back, and that actually pushed the Allies back 50 miles. And this created a large bulge in their line battle, or in their line, and this is what is called the Battle of the Bulge, which is still the single largest battle fought in U.S. history, with more than 70,000 casualties. But by January and into February, the assault had ultimately failed. The German army was just strung out too far. They were still in the east. They were trying to fight in the west. Things weren't going well for the Wehrmacht by then. So in March, American troops crossed the Rhine River, which we talked about, the Rhineland, into Germany, and this is when Hitler took his own life. And shortly after that march, the Soviet Union occupies Berlin, and on May, we get VE Day, which is the famous picture of Churchill holding up the peace sign. It uses the peace sign now, but the first time that you saw that sign, and it really meant something, was when Churchill did it for Victory in Europe Day. But at the same time, although, by the way, Mussolini killed himself a day after Hitler did, or vice versa. I can't remember which one. They died one day apart from each other. I can't remember who committed suicide first, but when the other one heard about the other one, he also committed suicide. But Japan had not surrendered yet. So all of the focus turned to the east, and you can go through a lot of politics of it, but we'll just kind of go over what was happening there and why Truman decided to use the bomb. In 1944, FDR did win his fourth term as president, but he had a stroke in April of 1945, and he eventually passed away because of that stroke and because of his polio. And so you get Harry S. Truman, and who was his vice president, and really he made one of the most momentous decisions in U.S. history, probably up there with the Emancipation Proclamation by Abraham Lincoln. The funny thing is he didn't know about the bomb until after he was president, and this was the first time that they had the realization that the theory of relativity actually may work. Basically, real quickly, the nuclear bomb is all it is energy and matter. Uh, and those two things are of the same phenomenon. So by using uranium or man-made plutonium, you could turn that mass into energy, and this energy could be harnessed, and then that's how we have, that's a very layman's term way of saying how we have nuclear energy today and how they built such big bombs. And it was first tested in 1945. In fact, I think that there's a show on TV now called the Manhattan, which is about the Manhattan Project and how the atomic bomb was created. A lot of people argue that this was the logical conclusion to World War II because the nature of World War II, of war, was so much different than any war before it, meaning that for the first time in history, civilians were really targeted for a political purpose on a massive scale, right? You obviously had the Holocaust, but you also had the Allied bombings of Dresden and other places. You had the bombings of Berlin. You had, for the first time in history, both sides, Stalingrad, both sides were targeting civilians to try to win the war. So a lot of people argue dropping the bombs on Japan was a kind of a logical conclusion to the ending of the war, since this was the first war that had ever happened. The interesting thing is when the Allies bombed Dresden, they killed almost 100,000 people, which is nearly as many that died because of the two atomic bombs, depending on whose stats you're looking at. But anyways, actually, Dwight Eisenhower would later say how much he hated the use of it. But the idea is this, and you guys can watch the video, and here's the argument for it and against it. Obviously, the arguments against it are quite easy, right? It's you shouldn't bomb civilians. You shouldn't use nuclear war on anybody. But the pro was this: the United States military, since Japan was not going to surrender, estimated that 1 million people, both Japanese and American people, would die in the oncoming battles if America and the United States and the Allies, they had to go island to island to eventually take over Tokyo. So the estimation, and it's a conservative estimation, is that there would have been 1 million casualties. So here's Truman, and he has to decide what he wants to do to end the war quickly and do something that nobody's ever done in the history of the world, or just to try to go island to island and take out these targets and take out Japan. I mean, eventually Japan would have to go down, but many people in the American government felt like Japan was not going to surrender, although there were some kind of overtures that were really quiet from certain individuals, but as a government and as a military, Japan was not going to surrender. There's also an idea, and this more of a political idea, is that once the war in Europe ended, Stalin had moved the Red Army east, and he was moving it down into Southeast Asia, right? He was coming into China, into Siberia, and he was going to try to take over Japan, and he already said 90 days after the end of the war in Europe, I'll be down there to help you guys finish off Japan. So a lot of other people argue that the reason why Truman dropped the bomb is he wanted to have some type of American influence during the war or after the war, and the reason why he did it is drop the bomb is so Stalin couldn't go there and take over Japan. Which, by the way, when they met earlier at a conference, Truman dropped the hint that we had the bomb. So Stalin had already known that we had the bomb. So he was trying to move his troops as quickly as possible to have some type of influence in Asia, because everybody knew by this time, because of everybody had been planning the post-war world, that the world was going to be divided between communism and capitalism or democracy. Um, and this was the Potsdam. This is when they met in Potsdam. So really, what ends up happening after the bomb is obviously Japan surrenders. But more importantly, what ends up happening, maybe not more importantly, but what also ends up happening is by the end of the war, you have this split between communism and democracy, and people and then Europe starts being divvied up, right? Berlin gets cut into four pieces, Germany gets cut into four pieces, and west of that was democracy. East of that was Poland, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Bulgaria, Hungary, places like that, and those all fell into the communist sphere of influence. Same thing with Korea. Korea gets split in half, which we'll see will start the Korean War. Vietnam gets split in half between capitalism and democracy. China goes through the Communist Revolution, and so by 1949, China is under Mao Zedong, who is a communist, so that scares America. And so really the only foothold that America has in Asia will be in Japan and the Philippines and South Vietnam and South Korea. So they're all planning this post-war world. They're all divvying up little sections of it. And you also at this time, to stop, and we'll talk a little bit about it more next week, but to stop the flow of communism, you get things like the Marshall Plan. You get things like the International Monetary Fund, who loans, which is an international bank that loans funds to to countries who need it. You get the United Nations. And really, this is when the dollar becomes the main currency of the world. But the one thing you don't get is you don't get harmony, right? The end of the war meant peace, but it didn't mean harmony. So we'll discuss next week about the Korean War and why World War II didn't really solve all the problems that everybody thought it would.